Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about bees, specifically honeybees, and why they are so critical to our natural world. My guest today is Bill Lewis. Bill is an active beekeeper. He's also a former president of the California State Beekeepers Association, and he's also the proprietor of a company known as Bill's Bees. Welcome, Bill, and thank you for joining us here on Talking Points.
Well, good morning, Dave. Thank you for having me and letting me share some of my experiences with bees over the last 30-some years.
Well, let's talk about your experiences for a moment. I'm going to summarize. I know that you got involved in beekeeping as a Boy Scout back in about 1969 or 70. You wanted that merit badge that comes with beekeeping. And that was in Wisconsin, where you grew up, which is a very cold state. We're going to talk about that and how bees can survive and thrive in a cold state. You then went to college, got your degree in engineering from Purdue University, and decided to travel west to California. You got involved in the aerospace industry here as a mechanical engineer for about 10 years, and then something happened where you had the opportunity to make a lifestyle change, and it brought you back into beekeeping, and that profession has held your interest for the last 27 to 30 years, as you mentioned. And I wanted to start with that, and what is it about the bees and beekeeping that does have your interest, your passion as a profession, and also as a bit of a lifestyle?
It's not something everybody does, and a lot of people grew up kind of having a fear of bees, which you don't need to have. Don't be afraid of bees. We need them. It's something you can do at all levels, from 1 or 2 colonies in your backyard to thousands of colonies, and make a living doing it at almost every level.
Okay. Well, let's talk about bees. We're going to actually have some show and tell a little bit later with a bee colony that you brought in today. But before we do that, we want to establish some factual information and fascinating information about bees, specifically the honeybees again. So why are honeybees so important to our natural world? What do they do for us?
Honeybees are the only pollinators that are movable. You can move those hives anywhere they're needed in the country within a few days. Load them on trucks and haul them from Florida all the way to California to pollinate almonds in February is a good example. Our crop of almonds in California requires 2 million colonies of bees, which is basically all the bees in this country. But they're also responsible for pollinating about 1/3 of the food that we consume. And all of those brightly colored vegetables that you buy at the grocery store, fruits, nuts, vegetables, would not be there without the honeybee.
So they are very critical because our diet depends on it. Let me ask you about the bees and the pollination process. We know that they provide the wherewithal for us to have these wonderful crops, but what do the bees get out of it? What do they get out of it, and what do they take away from the pollination process?
Well, they get food out of it. That's their motivation. When I take, for example, bees to an orange orchard, on my trip up there, I can start to smell the nectar in the air. And I believe the bees get just as excited when I unload them at night, and they can smell that nectar all night long, and in the morning they just explode out of the hives because they know there's food there for their thriving colony.
All right, well, when we talk about bee colonies and bee hives, what do those terms mean? Are they basically the same thing?
It is basically the same thing. A hive, a colony, is a stack of boxes that contain that social group.
Okay, when we talk about a colony or a hive, there's a tremendous amount of organization going on in that hive or that colony. How do the bees know how to organize themselves, and how do they communicate with one another?
I think that's one of the things that fascinates me most about bees is there's so many of them, up to 80 to 100,000 in a hive, and they're in very close quarters. They work together for the the superorganism, that whole hive, as one. And they make decisions about where food sources are, where to send bees to gather it, how to find a new home. There's a really great book called Honeybee Democracy. Look it up. It's fascinating. It's written by Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell University, and it's a fascinating. If our democracy could work as well as a beehive at making decisions, we could go a long way, I think, into making this world a better place to live.
Well, just to insert a little joke here, I mean, we always talk about a hive mentality. Well, maybe we need a little more of that if it means more cooperation and more working together.
We could certainly use the beehive as a perfect example of that.
All right, well, typically in a beehive or a bee colony, you have a queen bee that's selected by the other bees, so there's more democracy in action there, I guess, in the beehive. So they select a queen, and the queen is more or less a breeding machine who's just active, more or less all day, all night, creating baby bees and also mating with a series of different drones, which are the male bees. So let's talk about that for a moment. First of all, why are the males the drones, and why are the females the worker bees? And what's the ratio in terms of numbers of the number of worker bees that you have versus the number of drone bees or male bees?
There's lots of interesting discussion that can go on with that, but it is the workers, the females. They develop from a fertilized egg. Drones develop from a non-fertilized egg. The males have one purpose in life, and that is to mate with the queen if they're successful. In the fall and winter months, they don't really do any other work in the hive other than help to keep the hive warm. So they basically get pushed out of the hive in the fall and winter months. Otherwise, they would consume food that the colony needs to keep itself warm through the winter months. So if they haven't done their mating job, they get pushed out and basically starve to death. And it is the workers that determine which egg may become a new queen, because any egg that queen lays, fertilized, can potentially become a queen. And it all depends on the size of the cell that the bees build around that developing egg and larva, and the food that developing larva is fed, royal jelly.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of numbers, what is the ratio of worker bees or female bees to the drones in the typical situation?
Well, of course it varies. In the winter there are very few drones. In the spring and summer months, especially if a colony gets crowded, one of the first signs that I see that they're thinking about swarming or splitting that colony and multiplying is an increase in the number of drones that they need to mate with a virgin queen from another hive. So probably less than 1% of the bees in the hive are drones at any given point in time, and less so in the winter.
All right, let's talk a little bit more specifically about individual bees. I guess an individual bee, and the reason we hear that buzzing sound is because of the flapping of the wings, and they can supposedly flap their wings as many as 200 times per second. What's your experience with bees and the flapping of the wings and so on? What causes them to, what's the lifespan when they're doing so much flapping of the wings?
So you're exactly right. The sound, the buzzing sound you hear is the sound of their wings beating against the air. When you hear a bee flying around when you're at the swimming pool, it's the sound of their wings that you hear. When I open a hive, sometimes the bees are very calm and they'll sit right there on the frames. Sometimes I'll start to hear the sound level rise. You'll get an increase in that hum, and the bees are moving air around. They're keeping that temperature in that hive at the optimum level for nurturing their young. if you open a hive that has not as nice a temperament, we have a lot of Africanized honeybees in Southern California and most of the southern states. You'll hear an elevated sound of buzzing as more bees come out of the hive to defend their space.
Mm-hmm. And so what is the lifespan of a bee typically when they're buzzing or flapping or beating their wings like that?
Typically in the spring and summer months, the lifespan of a bee is only about 6 weeks.
Okay.
And that's because they're doing a lot of foraging, gathering food, and their wings actually wear out. You'll see bees that start to have frayed tips on their wings, and they're nearing the end of their lifespan. But in the fall and winter months, those bees aren't doing as much flying, and they have to live all the way through the winter months and may live as much as 4 to 6 months through the winter and cold period of the year.
All right, well, let's talk about how bees create honey. How do they create honey? What's the process?
It's actually pretty simple. The bees gather nectar from flowers. They carry it back to the hive in a second stomach, basically a storage tank, in which they're adding enzymes to that nectar, which starts a digestive process, and basically regurgitate that nectar when they get it back to the hive, either to another bee or directly into a cell where that nectar is stored. But all the time they're transferring it to another bee or they're storing it in a cell, there are bees in the hive that are circulating warm, dry air from the outside through the hive, picking up moisture and then blowing it back outside. So they're dehydrating that nectar until it's down below about 17% moisture content. And then it's stable. It will not ferment. It'll basically keep forever. And it's a natural antibiotic.
Let's talk about cold states like Wisconsin, where you're from. How do bees survive during the cold winter months?
It's a little different than it is here in Southern California. In those cold months, they'll basically shut down their brood rearing. They'll form a tight cluster, even tighter than you'll see in our beehive later. And the warmth of their bodies will keep that cluster warm, but they're constantly circulating. The bees from the inside of the cluster move to the outside of the cluster. And as long as that cluster can get to areas in the hive where there's honey stored, which is their fuel, they can stay warm at about 98 degrees, even through the coldest winter months.
So they have to have enough honey to sustain them through the winter.
Correct.
Okay, on that note, we do have to go to the break. When we come back from the break, we'll do as I promised earlier, we'll take a look at Bill's bee colony that he's brought in for us with a bit of show and tell. You'll be fascinated. Stay tuned.
Make a difference in our future by researching and helping to preserve our natural resources. The wide variety of careers in this field will have a huge impact on our lives while using the principles of engineering, chemistry, and biology to help find solutions to environmental problems. You could be a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Bill Lewis. We're talking about beekeeping. And Bill, you were good enough to bring in a sample here for us to take a look at. This is an actual colony or a miniature hive, I guess? Is that what we're looking at?
It's a working colony. I can actually open a door and let them fly in and out of here. And a typical full-size colony, this is a frame. One frame that's in this display will have 10 frames in a box, and as many as 2, 3, 4. I've had them as high as 8 to 9 boxes in height.
And what are we looking at here? What are the bees actually doing? There's a lot of movement in and out around. Some of them I see are carrying little things here and there. What's going on?
The cluster of bees where in the middle is actually keeping their baby bees warm. They're raising bees inside this hive. There's honey stored up in the corner, their food supply. There's a queen in here that's laying eggs. At her peak spring, summer, she lays as many as 2,000 eggs a day. Now it's a lot fewer in the fall and winter months, but it's enough to sustain the colony.
And I can hear the buzzing sound even through the glass, because there's a glass covering here. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of activity, and as you mentioned, there's honey that's being generated up in the corner there. What about beeswax? This may not be the best example for beeswax, but where do we get beeswax?
Well, the honey in the corner is stored. That's their pantry. And if I were to harvest a frame that is completely honey, full of honey, we would actually shave off the top of that honeycomb, and that's beeswax that a beekeeper would collect. The entire comb is built from beeswax, which is basically honey with the molecules rearranged into beeswax. And that's the bee's construction material, and it comes from the same sugar source as the honey.
And this collection of bees, they don't seem to be bothered by us or what we're doing. I hear buzzing sounds in there, the beating of the wings, I guess. You see all the activity. They're not concerned about the studio lights. That doesn't seem to bother them. Are they okay in an environment like this?
They are okay in an environment like this. In fact, some large commercial beekeepers are now going to storing hives indoors in climate-controlled warehouses where the bees stay inside their hive for 4 to 5 months in the winter.
And I noticed there's venting on the top, and I believe there's some venting underneath, so they do need that airflow coming through.
Yes, bees breathe just like us humans, and so there's a screen on the bottom and a screen on the top, and there's a constant airflow through there, and the buzzing you hear is the bees actually moving that air around.
Okay, and how many bees approximately would you say are involved in this particular set?
There's probably up to 2,000 bees in this display.
Okay, so they live in very tight quarters.
Very much so, and this is pretty much the same amount of space as they would have in a full-size hive that has 10 frames right next to each other. It's a very dense population, close quarters, but they all get along.
Let's talk about honey. You've brought some samples of honey here, so let's go ahead and talk about those for a moment.
So I brought examples of some of the crops that we go to throughout the year. This lighter colored one is from orange orchards. The darker one is actually from our local mountains. It's our California buckwheat, bushy plant, white flower, a little red in the middle. And the third one is avocado blossom. We take bees there to help pollinate those trees so they make avocados, and we make some honey too.
You know, Bill, I know that you're very active in farmers markets and selling honey products in farmers markets. Why would it be more advantageous for me to get my honey at a farmer's market as opposed to the industrialized honey that we can buy in a commercial grocery store?
Buy it at your local farmer's market because you know the source. You can speak to the beekeeper, you can talk about what he does, or he or she, but you know the source of that honey. Particularly here in Southern California, we're producing honey from local plants, and it's
locally sourced.
It's locally sourced.
That's a good one. How about the shelf life of honey? When you go to the store and you buy honey off the shelf at the grocery store, it's going to have an expiration date on that. Do we need to be worried about expiration with honey?
Expiration dates on honey baffle me. I think that's a USDA thing, but there is no expiration on honey. It's a natural antibiotic. It's stable. It will, most honeys will eventually change texture and crystallize. Those are just honey crystals. Use it the same way you would otherwise. It dissolves really easy in hot tea or coffee. Spread it on your toast and it won't run all over the place. So 500 years from now, that same bottle of honey is going to be just as good as it is today.
So when you have honey and you see this starting to get hard and crystallize and so on, you naturally think, I better throw that away, but it's not necessary to throw it away.
Don't ever throw honey away. It never spoils. You can use it on a cut or a scrape as an antibiotic because it kills bacteria.
What about putting it in the refrigerator as opposed to keeping it in the pantry at room temperature?
The best temperature to crystallize honey is actually 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you put it in the refrigerator, it's going to crystallize much quicker. And if you like it that way, put it in the refrigerator. Otherwise, store it on your countertop.
Let's move on and talk about another phenomenon that's been of a lot of concern in the last few years, and that is the bee colony collapse disorder that we've been hearing about, where we've lost a lot of bees. What has caused, or what were the various causes for the bee colony collapse?
Bee colony collapse is real. It's ongoing. It really hasn't gotten any better. Our bees are having trouble. And I firmly believe the trouble that I've had most is loss of habitat, loss of locations that have good, clean forage to feed those bees. I can take them to an orchard that's blooming, but it only blooms for a few weeks. And then it turns into a desert for a beehive, and I have to take the bees somewhere else to keep them fed. So loss of food sources for bees, pesticides certainly is a concern. I do get notice from farmers actually that I have 2 days to move bees before they spray crops that could affect my bees. And it's actually worked out pretty well in California, but it does force me to move bees around. That move also affects the health of the colony sometimes. We have to go back and check to make sure they haven't lost a queen by accident. Some of the jostling in a move will be a detriment to the hive. But if you're taking them to a plentiful food source, the impact is very, very low.
So we've got loss of habitat, which is a big concern. Also the pesticides you've mentioned. I believe there's also a parasitic mite involved.
That's the third issue that we have. A Varroa parasitic mite's been with us. It's a small bug. It looks like a tiny little spider. You can see them with your naked eye on the bees. But what you see first are the effects of that mite on the bee. Sometimes you'll see a bee that has a deformed wing. Those mites are a vector for a whole host of viruses that can affect the health of the colony. And when you see that deformed wing, the colony is on a rapid decline and sometimes will not recover.
Can you arrest that if you catch it early enough?
You can, if you catch it early enough and take steps to mitigate the mites. And there's mechanical ways to do it, there's chemical ways to do it that work better than mechanical ways, but we have a whole toolbox worth of materials and methods to mitigate mites. And it's an ongoing fight. I feel it's like cancer for a beehive. It just keeps coming back.
What do we need to do to protect our bees?
The best thing we can do is make clean habitat available. There's a conservation reserve program in this country that pays farmers to grow habitat that's healthy for bees. We've moved kind of away from that and planted a lot of corn and soybeans in those areas, which has been a detriment to our bees, and other pollinators like monarch butterflies struggle because of loss of habitat. So you and we can plant flowers in our blooming plants in our yards. Will really help beehives. Provide a water source. not necessarily your swimming pool. Bees will go there to gather water. That's why they come to your swimming pool. They're not there to sting you. They're there to gather water that they carry home just like nectar, and they use it to control the temperature in their hive, like mini swamp coolers. Those are two things that we can do. We can also choose organic, which will cut down on pesticide use and be safer for bees in our agricultural fields.
We're starting to run out of time here, and I've got a couple more questions I want to go over. One is the Africanized bees. We've heard about this also for a number of years, and the fear was that the Africanized bees, which are much more aggressive, were going to invade all of our hives and colonies here. What about the Africanized bees? You've encountered them, you've seen it. What did you have to do to mitigate the effects of the Africanized honeybees?
They are much more aggressive in their defensive behavior if a colony is disturbed. And they can be dangerous because they will sting in large numbers. The sting potency is the same as our European honeybees, but I do see small Africanized colonies try to invade a European colony, especially in the fall and winter months. They're looking for food and they find it in a beehive. When I catch a wild swarm, the first thing I do is change the queen. I don't even wait for them to display their true character. I automatically change the queen so that I know the genetics of that colony. It's as simple as changing the queen to change the whole character of the hive.
All right, one last question. We are running out of time. How should humans behave around bees so that they're less likely to get stung?
Best way to behave is basically train your mind to pretend they're not there. They're not going to sting you unless you somehow pinch them, and it's usually by accident. You feel something on your arm or crawling up under your shirt sleeve. Make sure you look. If it's a bee, gently let them out, and they'll fly away. Sometimes they're there on a wet bathing suit just to get a drink of water. Do not swat them. When you hit them, you will pinch them, and that's how people get stung. So pretend they're not there.
And don't run away.
If a bee is chasing you and you can tell, they usually go for your face or your eyes, then it's best to quickly get out of the area, get in a car or a house, and you will lose those bees that are chasing you. But if one gets in your hair, they're burrowing in, that bee is on a mission to sting you, and she's sending you a message that you got too close to my hive.
But generally, they're not interested in attacking humans, but we have run out of time here. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, Dave, for having me on.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.